Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating and honestly deeply impactful subject. We're looking at how our brain's invisible mental shortcuts actually manifest in highly visible societal and legal outcomes. And hey, if you're a student trying to clearly distinguish between these complex psychological phenomena, you are exactly in the right place. We're going to systematically break down how our individual, everyday judgments quietly scale up into massive systemic structures. Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We'll start with the basics of mental shortcuts, then specifically differentiate between outgroup homogeneity, the fundamental attribution error, and system justification bias. After that, we'll see how these biases literally intersect with the law through moral licensing, and finally, look at empirical strategies to actually overcome these cognitive blind spots. All right, part one, the brain's mental shortcuts. Before we can differentiate between the specific mental errors, we need to lay down the foundation. So, at its absolute core, a cognitive bias is just a mental shortcut. Every single human brain uses these shortcuts to quickly process mountains of information. They influence our perception, our judgment, and they often operate completely below our conscious awareness. Like, we don't even know we're doing it. It's a universal human trait. But as the research clearly highlights, when these automatic shortcuts get applied to social groups, well, they can unfortunately play a massive role in upholding and perpetuating systemic inequity. Now, this right here illustrates where the modern empirical study of these phenomena really took off. This is Dr. Janet E. Helms. She is a truly pioneering research psychologist who essentially championed the idea that race, cultural diversity, and the biases surrounding them weren't just fluffy, abstract concepts. They were measurable phenomena that could be studied through hard, undeniable data. What's wild is that Dr. Helms faced significant pushback early in her career. Colleagues actually told her that race wasn't a real topic for psychological study. Can you believe that? But she persisted. She totally shifted the paradigm and laid the scientific groundwork, proving that systemic biases are real, measurable occurrences. Her empirical approach is literally what opened the door for us to clearly analyze the specific biases we're about to dive into. Which brings us to Section 2, Outgroup Homogeneity Bias, or as I like to call it, the illusion of sameness. Let's get into our first specific mental shortcut. Notice the really stark contrast here. This bias is strictly about how we incorrectly perceive diversity based on group membership. We tend to view our own group, the in-group, as being full of diverse, incredibly nuanced individuals. But then we look at the out-group and completely fall for the illusion of sameness. We just assume they're all essentially identical. But what actually happens when this little psychological illusion scales up into the real world? Well, it leads straight to institutional consequences. Because decision-makers fail to see individual nuance, sweeping generalizations take root. The data shows this mental shortcut leads directly to discriminatory policies. Think about security officers or law enforcement disproportionately targeting specific racial groups based entirely on automatic, generalized beliefs rather than actual individual behavior. All right, Section 3, Fundamental Attribution Error. We're moving from how we generalize people to how we place blame. To really distinguish this from the previous bias, you have to look at exactly where we place the blame. The fundamental attribution error makes us massively overemphasize internal characteristics, like personal flaws or moral deficiencies, when we try to explain why someone is disadvantaged. And at the exact same time, it causes us to completely overlook all the external factors. Things like structural, historical, or environmental realities. We just tune them out. To really ground this academic theory, let's think about a super relatable everyday scenario. You are driving down a busy highway and someone just abruptly cuts you off. Instinctively, and let's be honest, probably with some colorful language, this mental shortcut causes you to immediately blame that driver's internal character. You just assume they're a selfish jerk. What you vastly underestimate is the external environment. Like maybe they have a medical emergency in the backseat. So, what is the systemic ripple effect when this highway traffic shortcut gets applied to society at large? Well, instead of recognizing complex external structures, this error leads to widespread victim blaming. When people susceptible to this bias look at disparities in housing, healthcare, or economics, they automatically attribute those disadvantages to the moral deficiencies of the disadvantaged group itself, rather than ever addressing the overarching systemic flaws. Okay, moving right along to Section 4, System Justification Bias. This one completely shifts our focus from how we view others to how we defend the status quo. So, system justification bias is defined as the psychological tendency to defend, bolster, and rationalize the current political, economic, and social setup. Because the current arrangements are familiar and comfortable, this bias makes individuals inherently resistant to equity-focused reforms. Proposed alternatives aren't just debated, they are actively disparaged by the brain just to protect the familiar system. The really crucial point here is that system justification connects deeply to what researchers call the just world hypothesis. This is basically the adaptive belief that our environment is fair and predictable, that good, hardworking people succeed and bad people fail. When people who have privilege are confronted with hard evidence showing the system is actually unjust, this bias kicks in hard. It creates intense cognitive dissonance, and ultimately it leads to total inaction, just so they can maintain that comforting, predictable worldview. Section 5, Moral Licensing and Law. Now we're going to look at a fascinating macro application of these concepts. What actually happens when these biases step into the courtroom? The source material points to a specific federal legal doctrine used in U.S. courts known as the same actor inference. This doctrine basically says that if an employer hires a minority candidate, they are presumed to be unbiased, and therefore it is highly unlikely they would ever later discriminate against or unfairly fire that same employee. I mean, on the surface, that sounds like pretty solid common sense, right? But there is a massive, and frankly fascinating, tension between this legal assumption and actual behavioral science. Let's look at the psychological pipeline that behavioral economists and psychologists have actually documented. Step 1. A person makes an initial unbiased action, like hiring someone from a marginalized group. Step 2. That action ironically gives the decision maker a moral credential. They pat themselves on the back and now feel established as a perfectly egalitarian person. Step 3 is where the science gets truly wild. Because they feel morally licensed, the salience of egalitarian rules actually drops. This dramatically increases the likelihood that a subsequent biased action, like an unfair firing, will just be rationalized away as totally legitimate. So the scientific reality is essentially the exact opposite of the legal doctrine. Courts are out here applying a strong inference of non-discrimination when an employer has previously hired a marginalized candidate. But psychological science cautions that a prior non-prejudiced act actually changes the way people construe their own ambiguously discriminatory behavior later on. In short, the science suggests courts should be way more vigilant in these same actor scenarios, not less. Finally, Section 6, Overcoming Cognitive Blind Spots. We've covered some really heavy psychological ground here, distinguishing how these biases operate, but empirical research doesn't just point out the problems. Which leads us to the million-dollar question. How do we actually break this cycle of cognitive dissonance, attribution errors, and unearned advantage? How do we fix the blind spots? Well, one major finding revolves around how we frame inequity. Research shows that people respond very differently based on simply how a problem is phrased. If inequity is framed as a minority disadvantage, dominant groups are relatively comfortable. It doesn't challenge their self-esteem at all. But when the exact same inequity is framed as white advantage, it threatens group esteem and immediately prompts those defensive biases we talked about. Acknowledging an unearned advantage is psychologically so much harder than acknowledging someone else's disadvantage. And this is exactly where self-affirmation theory comes into play. The data shows that if you provide an opportunity for individuals to affirm their core values first, their basic self-integrity, it actually erodes the link between self-image threats and the expression of prejudice. When people feel secure in their own individual values, they become significantly more capable of tolerating threatening information and way more likely to actually acknowledge systemic flaws and historical wrongdoing. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought directly from the source research. To have a truly comprehensive conversation about inequity requires that dominant group members be willing to consider that dominant group members benefit from their advantaged status. You see, overcoming our mental shortcuts isn't just about spotting the errors in everyone else. It's about actively examining our own psychological frameworks and the unearned privileges they might be working overtime to protect. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helped you clearly map out the architecture of our social cognition. Keep learning, and most importantly, keep questioning.